All right, so let's take a look at a couple ways we can use progressive reveals and hides to reduce the amount of on-screen text on our slides while also using more graphics to reinforce and support the narration. That way we're not using text to continuously, repeat what's being spoken or what's being narrated. So here's what we have. We have a slide, 50 seconds long, it's fully narrated, and I'm going to use 24 animated objects. So what's your first impression on that? Right? Probably this, no way this is going to be appropriate or even work. Well, I think it can work, and I think it can also be a good example for ways to represent some of the content by using images that will really support only the part of the content that's being really narrated at that one time. So here's our slide. This is sort of a example that came to us, and we basically have about 110 words on the slide. And this is what we're going with. So we introduce the 4 phases, and then we begin by talking about the first phase, which is actually the closing phase. So, and I get it, right? Depending on the learning design model, you might break up this into smaller chunks and have maybe 25 words per slide. Totally get that. But we don't always have that choice. So sometimes a slide is what we have, and we have a choice of either building this out with text and maybe fading large blocks of text on the slide, or doing something else, and that maybe includes using images to summarize each of these slides. Because a lot of times, right, we use images and we'll select that one image that kind of summarizes the entire slide. Well, if we look at this and break this into those smaller pieces that it's going to be narrated and look at using images that actually go along with each of these, I think we can reduce some text while at the same time using images to better summarize what's being spoken. So just as an example, here's what we have. Let me go ahead and rewind this. And I'll click play. And you can see the narration is right over here on the side.
Loan file documents. The 4 phases of the loan origination process are application, loan processing, underwriting, and closing/funding. During the closing phase, all necessary loan documents are signed and recorded, and the property title is passed from seller to buyer.
Okay, so at this point, we pretty much got through about a third of our script, right? We talked about the 4 phases, which is right down here. And then we talked about what happens during the closing phase in terms of how the documents are passed from the seller to the buyer. So at this point, we have 3 main images or graphics on our slide. We have the signing of the documents, we have the 4 phases, and then we have what's going on between the seller and the buyer. The next part of the narration of this slide talks about the documents that are compiled for the closing package. So it kind of focuses really right here on this part, the title. So the buyer and the seller can go away, the signing of the documents could go away, and we could remove the 4 phases, but this is actually a consistent element across all 4 phases. So we're going to leave this up. So really we just want to get rid of the people, the seller and the buyer, and the image. And then as we continue on with the narration, those will fade out, and then we'll go through the rest of the slide. And then when we get to the end of this part, we'll fade those off and then bring in the final content. So we really aren't fading anything more than about 2 or 3 objects in at one time, but it's kind of pacing appropriately with the narration. So let's take a look at the PowerPoint file. So a couple things to look at. The first thing is, if I hide everything, this is my starting background. And then these are the elements that actually come out in that first block of the text. The other part of it are these elements up here, that I gave a prefix to called top. And by doing that, I can keep track of all the elements that need to remain that are persistent across all of the transitions. So I always want to be able to keep taking those on top. So what happens is I come over here, I select Control C, and then I paste it, and that covers everything, right? What I would do is I would take these 4 top items, right? Control click, and I would move them above that element. And now I can go ahead and begin building my next part of the content. Now, if you're thinking, why don't I just fade, select each object and then fade them out? I could easily do that, but that's an extra 4 or 5 objects that I have to select and add a fading animation to, and it just makes the animation window that much longer. So by using these selective covers, what I call the transition covers, and just giving that a new name, transition 3, transition 2, and so on, I can fade out all of those elements at one time with just a single object. So they actually remain on the slide, and I just use this cover to fade over them and cover them as I need to. So just another way to kind of look at, using your slides or kind of viewing them as layers and then only showing the learner what they need to see at a specific time in the slide.